Welcome everybody, my name is Paolo Pialorsi and I work as a senior consultant at psys.com. In this video we will talk about calling custom web APIs from SharePoint Framework, and specifically I will show you a demo of an Azure function that can be used and invoked by a SharePoint Framework client-side web part. This is the function I'm going to use, and as you can see, it is based on a response which simply provides back to the calling user the collection of claims describing the identity of the calling user, together with the date time of the request, as well as with a list of customers based on the well-known and famous Northwind database. In order to be able to call this function from SharePoint Framework, we need to leverage the capabilities provided since version 1.6 of SharePoint Framework, which allow us to use Azure Active Directory to secure the consumption of an external API. Before digging into the code, let me show you the UI of the sample web part that I'm going to use and describe. And here we have a client-side web part with a simple call Azure function button, which I can click and which will give you back the list of customers defining the Azure function together with the identity of the calling user. Well, let's see how this web part is implemented. So we have our Play with AAD Secure API web part, which is a very common base client-side web part of SharePoint Framework. However, in the onInit method of the web part, we use the AAD HTTP client factory object available through the context of SharePoint Framework in order to get an instance of the client for consuming the API based on this specific URI. This is the unique URI of the app registered in Azure Active Directory that you want to consume from SharePoint Framework. By doing that, you get back an instance of an object of type AAD HTTP client that you can use to consume the target API. What I do in this sample web part is just providing that object to the properties of the React component that I use to render the UI, and in the React component I simply render my web part providing a call Azure function JavaScript function which will do the real call to my target API. So basically in this function I simply use the AAD HTTP client object that I get from the client web part, and I use the get method of this object, and it provides not only the get but also the fetch and post HTTP methods for the target API. I provide the URL of the target function, which will be just a configuration property of my web part. I will use version 1 of AAD HTTP client configuration, and I will provide a request options object. This object will be made by a set of settings, including in my scenario a set of custom HTTP headers, which will simply be one header declaring that we accept an application JSON response. So we are basically declaring to the target API that we want to get back a JSON response. By making this GET request through the AAD HTTP client object, we will get back an HTTP client response, which can be seen as a JSON object, and by doing that, we can have access to the claims describing the current user's identity, as well as the collection of customers that we get back from the API. And of course, in the render method, we simply render the customers in a detailed list, and we show the identity of the user through the message declaring that the user is the UPN that called our API. In order to do that, we also need to declare in the settings of our client-side solution, of our SharePoint Framework solution, that we need to have access to a target API that we want to consume. And in order to do that, in the config folder of our solution, under package.solution.json file, we need to declare the Web API permission request section. In this section, we declare what are the permissions from an Azure Active Directory authentication and authorization perspective that we need to have in order to being able to call our target API. So, the API by itself is declared with this unique URI, and we declare that for consuming that API, from a settings perspective, we want to have the user impersonation permission. Why? Because if I go back to my target tenant, I can show you in the portal.azure.com site that under Azure Active Directory, in the app registration section, we have an application which is the SPFX lop function. which is exactly the Azure function that I'm consuming from SharePoint Framework. If I click on this item, we can see that this application under the manifest has a specific identifier URI, which is exactly and precisely the one that I provide to the SharePoint Framework code when I get an instance of the client based on the unique URI of my target API. Moreover, in the open authorization permissions of my application registered in Azure Active Directory, I have the user underscore impersonation permission declared, which is the permission that will be required to being able to invoke to use this app as a backend API, which is again exactly what I declare in the package solution file in order to being able to use my target API through my SharePoint Framework solution. Moreover, I need to secure the Azure function that I defined right here using Azure Active Directory and leveraging exactly that app registration that I showed you. And in order to do that, if you go to the function app in Azure, you can go under the authentication configuration. And here we have our function configured for using authentication and specifically to use the Azure Active Directory authentication, which is configured like we can see by clicking on this item. And we can see that we have a client ID, which is exactly the client ID of the application registered in Azure Active Directory, together with the issuer URL, which will identify Azure Active Directory for our target tenant. Of course, we have a client secret, which is hidden in this video. And we have the audience for our API, which is precisely the unique URI, which identifies our application in Azure Active Directory. So on one side, on the SharePoint Framework side, we declare the permission that we need. We create an instance of the client object providing the unique URI of the target function or of the target application that we want to consume. And we simply use the AD HTTP client object to make the request. On the Azure function side, we register the Azure function for Azure Active Directory authentication and authorization. Once we have done that, we package the solution. So we do the gulp bundle and gulp package solution. We will get back an SPPKG file. And so by going to the app catalog of our tenant, we can simply drag and drop the SPKG file of our solution. And by dropping the file in the app catalog, we will be prompted with the UI to deploy the solution onto the target tenant, and we will be able to see that the application is requested a specific set of permissions. And as you can see, right here in the UI to deploy the SPPKG package onto my target tenant, I can eventually make the solution tenant-wide available if it is configured in the package solution.json file. And we can also see that this application requires the following permissions to be reviewed by an administrator. For the SPFX lob function, we need the user underscore impersonation permission, which is the one I declared in the package solution.json file. Once I've done that, as an admin, I can go to the admin portal of SharePoint Online, and let me do that. So I will open a new tab and I will go to the admin portal of my SharePoint Online environment. And under, okay, got it, under the API management section in the advanced group section, we can easily see, okay, get rid of this, we can easily see that we have a list of pending approvals as well as a list of approved permissions. And here we can find, we will be able to find sooner or later the permissions for our SPFX line of business function for user impersonation. We can select this item and we can approve or reject the permission request. By doing that, as an admin, we will grant the permission to our SharePoint Framework solution and actually to the whole SharePoint Framework solutions that we have in our tenant to use the target SPFX lob function with the user underscore impersonation permission. If you want to grant those permissions uniquely to a specific application, you can create an isolated domain solution in SharePoint Framework, which is a topic that we will cover in another video.